Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I see some new faces. This is awesome. We are passing around a sign-in sheet. If you wouldn't mind signing in with your name and your zip code, we do like to collect that information for grant applications in the future. But because we have some new faces, I will reintroduce myself. My name is Shelby Boatman McKay, and I am the Executive Director of the Clinton County History Center here in Wilmington. And our mission is Clinton County history and genealogy for everyone, so that includes you guys in this room. So thank you for joining us. Very excited to have Peter Bronson with us this afternoon, all the way from Cincinnati. I want to thank, I was looking back at emails, we probably started talking like June or July of last year. And Peter had reached out. He had actually came into the museum and he said, I heard this story about General Denver and I kind of want to prove it or get some more information. So we were able to provide some photographs and some additional content for his book, which was a great partnership, and we really appreciate him coming in. Let me read his bio for you really quick, just so you can get a better understanding. I know that we have some super fans in the room. I'm looking at Rod McKay there. But Peter Bronson is a newsman, editor, magazine writer, author, and owner of Chili Dog Press Publishing. He has written 10 books, including Magical History Tour, which is the book that he is selling as well as others this afternoon, and that we sell in our gift shop as well. And then Promised Land, The Man Who Saved Cincinnati, Not in Our Town, and Forbidden Fruit. He was editorial page editor and columnist for the Cincinnati Enquirer for nearly 20 years. And under his leadership, the Enquirer was judged best editorial page in Ohio 4 years in a row. Congratulations. Before coming to Cincinnati in 1992, he was editorial page editor and columnist for the Tucson Citizen in Tucson, Arizona. He started his career in Michigan after graduating from Michigan State University. We won't talk about Michigan here. In his hometown of East Lansing. He has served on several nonprofits, including the Casa de los Niños Home for Abused Children in Tucson, the Northern Kentucky Children's Home, Leadership Cincinnati. We have Leadership Clinton here. Yes, we love that program. And various other organizations. He was a regular panelist and producer on the Channel 9 WCPO TV show Hot Seat, and also on the panel for a weekly Tucson news show, Arizona Illustrated. He is active as a group leader at Horizon Community Church and enjoys golf, travel, and classic cars. He is the father of two and lives with his wife Kathy in Milford, Ohio, near Cincinnati. So it is my sincere pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to author Peter Bronson.
I got to give her credit too. She's one of the first people who's introduced me in a long time who got the name of Casa de los Niños correct. That is often butchered, I can tell you. I used to do it myself. And also, as a thank you for Shelby and all the things that she did to help me with these short stories, especially James Denver, half of whatever we sell here is going to go back to the museum. So we'll make a donation to the Clinton County Historical Society. So you can get a book and still donate to the society too. Now, I don't know if I'm standing in front of this, I can move over this way. Let's do that. Okay, is this in anybody's way right here? I can move this as well. Uh-oh, are we losing it? Oh.
There we go, we're good. There you go. You got it.
Got it?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, I'm not going to touch anything, I promise. Okay, so can everybody hear me? Do I need to use the mic? Does that help? Okay. So when I left the Enquirer, I had written a history column, a local history column for about 4 years, in addition to my political columns and various topics. And when I left the Enquirer, I decided I wanted to investigate some of these great stories of local history. It turns out Cincinnati is super rich in history. We have some of the most stellar history of any region I've been in. And I've lived in Arizona, which is pretty Wild West, and Michigan. Sorry about that. And but anyway, so when I started, the first book I decided to investigate was the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. This happened in 1977. 165 people lost their lives. It was has often been described as an accident or something that was caused by faulty wiring. That is not true. I can tell you after investigating it, there is just ample, abundant evidence that this was an arson. And it's actually closer to 180 to maybe even 200 people who lost their lives. 4 of the women who were killed that night were pregnant, and others committed suicide because of the things they'd seen, or they had lingering lung problems and damage to their body from the combustion byproducts of that fire. It was a horrible night. As you can see, some of you may remember some of these scenes that were on TV. But what built up to it that was so fascinating was a 40-year empire of organized crime in northern Kentucky. Now, when people used to tell me this in the newsroom, I always dismissed it as just a bunch of guys who thought they were mobbed up, but no, this was the big-time mob. Mainly Cleveland 4 mob from Cleveland, but also they came down from New York City, from Chicago. All the big mobsters would meet in Newport because this was the wide-open city for the mob. It was sort of their little Switzerland, where everybody could be neutral and play together, and boy, did they play. They set up all these casinos. We had characters who showed up in this story, such as Mo Dalitz. He was the big boss of the Cleveland mob. He's the one who came down and saw the Beverly Hills Country Club and decided they had to have it. And he made an offer, I'll buy you out or I'll burn you out. Well, the guy who was running it, Pete Schmidt, this is in the 1930s, said no, because he was a tough guy. He was one of the gangsters who helped George Remus build his bootlegging empire. So he said no, and sure enough, Mo Dalitz and his thugs burned out the Beverly Hills Country Club, and that was the first fire. One little girl died, and that was in 1930s. So then we meet people like Red Masterson, who was the hitman for the Cleveland mob. He admitted to a reporter that he killed more than 100 people personally. Most of the time he would do it with a pair of 38s that he used, but sometimes if he wanted to send a special message, he would do what they called the Newport nightgown, which was to wrap somebody in chains and then push them off the suspension bridge. We had George Radaman. Anybody remember that name? George Radaman was the reformed sheriff who was framed by the mob. He was put in bed. First they gave him knockout drops, and then they put him in bed with a stripper named April Flowers. And unfortunately, fortunately really, it backfired on the mob, and it led to a huge story that went coast to coast. I even found headlines about George Radaman in Tokyo. That's how big a story that was. And this guy that's featured here is Screw Andrews. He was the thug who took over Newport after all the big boys left town when Bobby Kennedy, of all people, came in to clean up Newport. And surprisingly, surprised the heck out of me, that was where the Kennedy family, Bobby and Jack, declared war on the mob, and where the mob declared vendetta on the Kennedys. And you can follow that all the way through history and see what happened. One of the things I was able to do is I went to a place called the FBI Vault, where they keep all this classified information, but it ages out of classification. So it's now available to the public, but you have to know what you're looking for. So you plug in words, and I got 3 compact discs crammed with information about the mob, and the Kennedys, and the Newport in its heyday. It was fascinating. A lot of that's in the book. The next one I did was called, this is called Not in Our Town, and this one is about the way the mob was trying to get a foothold in Cincinnati during this period. They had Newport, they controlled northern Kentucky. It was, they had, the beat cops were crooked, the judges were crooked, the council members, all of the politicians, the mayor, the sheriff, everybody was on the payroll for the mob in northern Kentucky. But they wanted a piece of Cincinnati. And there were people during those days who made sure the mob didn't come across the river. One of them was this man on the left, that's Machine Gun Bob Melton, a Cincinnati police detective. And he had a Thompson, what they call a Chicago typewriter, a Thompson submachine gun, and he used it enthusiastically. He challenged the mob to meet him any day on Monmouth Street at high noon, and he'd be there with his Thompson, and nobody showed up. These guys look like a scene from The Godfather, but they're actually Cincinnati police detectives. And they carried sawed-off shotguns, and they carried submachine guns because that's the stuff the mob was using. Now this would be considered a scandal to think that Cincinnati police were carrying weapons like this. Well, the real face of the mob in Cincinnati turned out to be Larry Flynn. He ended up coming to Cincinnati And he claimed that he was a great entrepreneur who had one little bar in Dayton, and he turned it into this massive empire of smut. Well, the truth is that he had bankrupted 11 bars in Dayton. He was such a bad businessman. And the only way he opened the Hustler Club in Cincinnati was because he had an $800,000 bankroll from the Cleveland mob. So when Larry Flynt was finally shot, the FBI's first assumption was that this was a mob hit because he was behind in his payments. It turned out otherwise, but it's a fascinating story of how the mob finally got its foothold in Cincinnati. Another sub-story in that book is what happened to the newspaper industry during my career. When I started out, the Cincinnati Enquirer newsroom would have looked like that in the 1970s, about 130 people in the newsroom, all just breaking news and having fun and reporting, and it was a wild place, but it was super fun. And this is what the Enquirer looked like the last time I visited when I was doing research for this book. Nobody was there, the lights were out. It's pretty much just a ghost, and it's very sad. The next book, I'm getting through these a little bit quickly because I want to get to the main event, which is all about Wilmington. So this book that I did next goes back to the 1862, and it's all about this man who saved Cincinnati. His name was General Lew Wallace. Just a little brief summary of his CV or resume would tell you that he rescued Cincinnati when it was panicked and torn by riots and on the brink of surrendering to an army of 10,000 Confederates who marched north from Lexington and came as far as Fort Mitchell. And they were threatening to burn the city, hold it for ransom, or loot it, because Cincinnati had tons of stuff the Confederates desperately needed. Horses, mules, wagons, uniforms, money. Our banks had lots of gold. So, as the local mayor, who was a Copperhead, meaning a Southern sympathizer, was on the brink of surrendering to the Confederates, Lew Wallace showed up and said, no, the city's going to fight. And they said, how? We don't have any troops. We don't have any cannons. He said, everybody is going to go out there and work, and I'm going to declare martial law, and the city will defend itself. So lawyers and ditch diggers were lined up together, and they marched across that bridge that you see in the lower left hand, which is also the first bridge across the Ohio River that was built by Lew Wallace. And that was so that everybody, all the volunteers who were ordered to carry either a pickaxe or a shovel or a rifle, would go across the river into northern Kentucky and set up a string of defenses to protect Cincinnati. And he did that in 3 days. It's a fantastic story, but only one of the stories that this man was involved in. He rescued Cincinnati. He formed the first Black Brigade during the Civil War, was formed right in Cincinnati by Lew Wallace. First time blacks were allowed to fight or join the battle to free their brothers and sisters in slavery. He was made territorial governor of New Mexico after the war, where he put down a range war, which was the most famous range war in U.S. history, called the Lincoln County Range War. And he also captured Billy the Kid. And he saved Washington, D.C. during the war from a similar attack to Cincinnati. And while he's doing all of this, he also wrote an American classic called Ben-Hur. This man was amazingly accomplished. He was a sculptor, a painter, he was an architect. He invented all kinds of things, including the first collapsible fishing pole. So even before the Popeil pocket fisherman, Lew Wallace was there. And if you want to go see his study and home, it's in Crawfordsville, Indiana, which is about 2.5 hours from here. It's a great day trip, and amazing things there. So this slide just tells you a little bit of how important the Queen City of the West was in those days. We were much bigger than San Francisco or Chicago. We were the 6th largest city in the Union. If we had been captured, it would have divided the Union Army and split it into the Western and Eastern Theater, and the Confederates would have controlled the Ohio River. That would have been the only northern city ever captured by the South. So it would have been profound implications, because it certainly would have meant Abraham Lincoln would not have been reelected. If he loses the 6th largest city, he's toast. He barely got reelected as it is. And one of the interesting little footnotes about Cincinnati that tells you just how important we are or were in those days is that in Spring Grove Cemetery, there are 41 Civil War generals buried. That's an awful lot of Civil War generals. And really proud of history there. So the next one is called Promised Land. And this we reach back all the way to the 1780s and 1790s when the first people were coming here to settle this area that was known then as the Ohio Territory. One of the people that knew about this was George Washington. Now, I found records at the Cincinnati Museum Center's archives that showed that he got as far west as Newtown and probably as far west as what we call Cincinnati today. He did that as a surveyor. When he was a young man, before he became known for all of the other exploits, he was a surveyor, and in those days, that was not just a guy who holds up a pole beside the highway. This was a guy who was kind of like the Indiana Jones of his era, because you would go into these unexplored territories and risk your life and go have adventures and try and come back and report what he found. Well, what he found in the Ohio Territory was abundant fresh water, fantastic soil, huge timber for building homes and stockades, abundant game and fish. It was like the Promised Land. It was ideal for settlement. So I think in those days, when he saw Ohio Territory the first time, he was committed this would be part of the future country. Now, the first people who came here came down the river on flatboats like this one, and they might have as many as 15, 14 children. 16 is not unusual. They would have all their livestock on this boat, all their farming implements, and they would float down on a string of these boats. And if they were lucky, they could get to Fort Washington, which is now Cincinnati, because this area was known in those days as the Miami Slaughterhouse. The Shawnee and the Miami tribes were so fierce that the eastern tribes wouldn't come west. And they would load up war canoes with 20 or 30 or 40 braves, and they would go out and attack these little flotillas of flatboats and just massacre everybody. If you were lucky to get here, you might live in a stockade like this. It was more of a prison than a home. Women often didn't leave these stockades for months at a time. Men only went out when they absolutely had to try and plant or harvest crops or hunt for their family to feed them, because they would be taken by Indians. The Indian depredations, as they called it then, today we would call it terrorism. The Indian depredations in one year took 1,500 people, which would be so many for such a small population that every family would have known somebody who was lost. And the way they were lost was especially brutal. They might be scalped right there on the spot and left to a lingering, painful death. They might be taken back to the village if they were healthy, where they might be tortured for 4 days. This was considered a big celebration. The whole village would turn out and everybody would take part. The Shawnee actually believed that the white people, which they called long knives because we carried swords, were not human. That whatever they did was just sport. Or they might take you from the banks of the Ohio River and make you walk all the way to Detroit, where they would sell you to the British as a hostage. And the British would then turn you into an indentured servant or a slave. A lot of families lost children, and a lot of men lost their wives, who were taken up to Canada and never seen again. Now, during this period, the Redcoats were actually sponsoring and financing and encouraging these depredations by the Indians, and they would pay $50 for every scalp. They would pay $100 per hostage. They would provide all of the weapons, the knives, the swords, the muskets and ammunition that the Indians wanted to encourage depredations on the early settlers. And the reason for this was that they wanted to make sure that we did not expand westward from the Allegheny Mountains. They wanted to pin the American settlers on the East Coast and then take all of this beautiful land in the Midwest for Canada. Now, they'd lost the Revolutionary War, but they hadn't given up on their colonial empire here. So Washington was aware of this. He sent, first he sent a militia group out to try and defeat the Indian Confederation. They were massacred. Then he sent this Revolutionary War general, Arthur St. Clair, and he was a famous Revolutionary War general, but by the time that he was fighting the Indian Confederation in Ohio, he was obese, he was a drunk, He could barely even get on his horse without 3 or 4 soldiers helping him up. He committed huge blunders and marched up to Defiance, Ohio, where he was surrounded and massacred again. This one was so bad they called it the Battle of 1,000 Slain, because that's how many soldiers and militia were lost. So finally, Washington turns to this man who is known as Mad Anthony Wayne. He got that nickname by being one of the most courageous, you might say foolhardy, reckless, special ops guys in Washington's army during the Revolutionary War. If he needed something that absolutely sounded like a suicide attack to be done, this is the guy he would choose. Well, unfortunately, after the war, Anthony Wayne just became a total mess. He was an excellent soldier, but he could not stand the peace. He became a scoundrel. He was brazenly dating a mistress in front of his wife and family, which was considered a really bad social crime in those days. He was booted from Congress for fixing elections. He was bankrupt. He was a mess. So when Washington asked Congress for $1 million, which is a lot of money in those days, to form a real professional army and let this man lead it, he had a lot of resistance from Congress. They said, Anthony Wayne, you've got to be kidding. But Washington knew his man. Anthony Wayne trained his troops up. He took them to northern Ohio, up around Maumee, near Toledo, and there was a forest there that had been hit by a tornado. And that was the site that became known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers. I'd often heard about that when I moved to Ohio, but I didn't really know what it was all about. Well, it turns out this was a pivotal battle that really set us on the course of westward expansion. Without this victory, we might all be Canadians today. Anthony Wayne charged his cavalry right into that forest. Although the Indians were dug in and they had natural defenses, he charged his cavalry in. And here's a famous painting of the leader of that charge being shot out of the saddle and killed. But Anthony Wayne surprised them so much that anybody would do something so foolhardy that they all ran. They ran all the way back to Fort Miami, which was a British fort, where they had been promised that if things went bad, they could come back and be safe there. Well, when the commander of the fort saw thousands of Indians running his way, chased by Anthony Wayne and his militias and his soldiers, they locked the door. They said they couldn't possibly allow another Revolutionary War to begin right there in Ohio. So the Indian Confederation and its alliance with the British was broken up for many years thereafter. The Indians never trusted the British again until the War of 1812, and then only a few. What else happened was Anthony Wayne rode up under the palisades of the fort and delivered an ultimatum. Well, all these British muskets are trained on him and eager to shoot him. But their commander again said, no, that would be an act of war, we can't do it. So he delivered an ultimatum that the British had to get out of Ohio and honor the Treaty of 1793 that they had signed to end the Revolutionary War. So as a result, all of this territory was set free and made part of U.S. possessions by Anthony Wayne. So what we know today as the Northwest Territory, or the Midwest, is all part of our nation because of his victory at Fallen Timbers. There's a great monument up there near the battlefield that shows Anthony Wayne with a militiaman on one side and an Indian scout on the other, and he's looking out south over all this territory that he set free, that he opened for settlement, which was really key at that time because the American colonies had been penned up on the East Coast, and we had such amazing levels of immigration coming over to the New World, and people were now no longer able to find land that they came here for. And so if we had been forced to stay behind on the East Coast without being able to expand westward, our country would have just withered, and it would have been basically only a collection of maybe 8 or 9 states. Today, we can thank Anthony Wayne for opening the West. This was truly the West then. Some scholars will tell you that this was the most pivotal battle with the Indians throughout American history, because after this, it was all just a matter of increased westward expansion, and then more battles, more mopping up, but the Indians had been defeated. The best chance the Indians had to stop the colonies was right there in Ohio. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and we're going to talk about this one. Magical History Tour is a collection of 5 short stories that tell you stories about some amazing things that happened here in our backyard. One of them involves the grave robbery in 1878 when grave robbers took a president's son. Now the president was William Henry Harrison. Maybe some of you know his trivia points is that he was the shortest term in office because he died of pneumonia very soon after he was inaugurated. He was the 9th U.S. president. His son, John Scott Harrison, was in his 70s and a very highly respected man on the west side of Cincinnati, had a farm, and he died suddenly in his sleep. And he was buried in what's known as Congress Green Cemetery. That's this little place here, one of the oldest cemeteries in Cincinnati. It's right next to Mount Nebo, where the William Henry Harrison Monument is located. You'll find just amazing old graves. The only one that's older is Pioneer Cemetery, as far as I know, which is right down by Lunken Airport, and that's where the first people who really did step off those boats were buried. So John Scott Harrison was buried by his family, and soon they came back and found that his grave had been plundered. His body was gone, the casket was smashed, and another grave nearby was also dug up and unearthed. Now this was not uncommon in those days. There was a string of conspiracy of grave robbers. In those days they called them resurrection men or body snatchers. And they made their money by selling these corpses as fresh as possible to medical students. So they eventually found John Scott Harrison here at the Medical School of Ohio, which was right about where the Cincinnati Hotel is today. And the way they found it was they went all the way to the top floor, and it was the most grisly, reeking place you can possibly imagine. These medical students were working with corpses that were not fresh, and all kinds of body parts lying around. And these resurrection men would, first thing they do would be strip the corpse and sell the clothes. So people would buy these clothes unaware that they're actually buying something that's just been pulled out of the grave. So in this room, they find vats of body parts and bodies on tables all over the place. And they found this funny-looking winch over there. And the winch has a rope that goes all the way down to the first floor of the Ohio College. And they cranked it up, and here comes a naked body with a sheet over its head. And sure enough, they pull off the sheet, and there is John Scott Harrison. And his son was standing there when they pulled it up. That was called the crank room. And what would happen is the resurrection men, or the body snatchers, would deliver these bodies in the middle of the night, and they'd put them on, they'd hook them to this winch, and then pull them up there to the dissection room on the top floor. It turns out that with the aid of the Pinkertons, Cincinnati police detectives uncovered a body snatching ring in Cincinnati that was covering the whole Midwest, and had delivered one of those bodies taken from Congress Green Cemetery they actually found at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Another reason we don't like Ann Arbor. So, and we feel that way in East Lansing, I can tell you. So that was a fascinating story. Okay, now we're going to go to, let's see here. There we go. The Gold Rush, Oregon Trail, 1850. And many of you are probably somewhat familiar with the story of James W. Denver. There are several Denvers, right? John Denver, Bob Denver, and only one of them is not smiling. And that's because people don't remember James W. Denver, but he was an amazing man with a fantastic history, very exciting. Here he is. I love this picture of him. This is not, look at that picture, that is not a guy you want to quarrel with. He looks like he means business. In fact, he looks like he could look right through you. So here we have him. This is his house, where he eventually came to live after all of his adventures. So let's start with his adventures. In the early days, about 1850, on the West Coast, the printing press looked like this, but there were lots of newspapers. They had to be printed in one handbill at a time. And James Denver got crossways with a local newspaper editor who decided to mock and slander him in his editorial columns. And James Denver got so upset about this, it finally came to words, and the newspaper editor challenged James Denver to a duel. Big mistake. The newspaper editor really didn't know much about handling guns at all. James Denver, having led a wagon train on the Oregon Trail through all kinds of attacks and perils, was a very good shot. He said he was a really good shot. So as the person who's challenged, he gets to choose the weapon. And he chose repeating rifles at 40 paces. That's a picture of the rifle that was used. They showed up on the field of honor, as they called it, and they marched off their 40 paces, and they, when the second, who is in charge of arranging this, said the word fire, the newspaper editor pulled the trigger and thought, I survived. I survived. He didn't hit me. And he thought he hit Denver. But what he saw instead was Denver standing there with his gun like this. And he finally just fired it in the air, and he says, okay, the requirements of our honor have been met. Now there was a code of dueling in those days. It was called the Code Duello. Had 25 separate items that tell you all the steps how you can satisfy honor without getting killed. And one of them was to, if both men fire shots and nobody's hurt, you can say, okay, that's it, time out, we all go home, honor has been satisfied. Well, this guy kind of reminds me of some of the editors I've worked with. He said, no, I want another shot, and which was extremely foolish. And Denver said at that point, therefore I must kill you. And that's exactly what he did. The next time they said fire, James Denver shot him through the hip, probably hit his femoral artery, and he bled out right there on the field of honor. And James Denver was later on in his life, he was considered for the ticket for the presidency of the United States on a couple of occasions. And this duel chased him like a ghost. People who loved the newspaper editor for political reasons made it out that James Denver had unfairly killed this man, even though he had given him a second chance, and didn't kill him until his own life was at risk. So it followed him throughout his life, and people used it and made political hay of it. But he was far from done with his career. As a reward for his political work, he was made the territorial governor of Kansas during a period that we call Bleeding Kansas. Maybe some of you have forgotten about this, but what really best way to summarize Bleeding Kansas is that it was a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. So what was happening was Kansas was going to be admitted to the Union, and the battle was over. Would it be a free state or a slave state? So the slave state people from Missouri came up into Kansas, and they fought to make it a slave state. And the free state people came from all over the East Coast, including Ohio, and the abolitionists came out, and they fought in Kansas to make it a free state. And one of those people who came from Ohio was this man, John Brown. John Brown, we know, is the guy at Harper's Ferry who helped ignite the Civil War later. At this period, he was a fanatic, a psychopath, a murderer. He went on rampages with his posse and killed multiple people who were often defenseless. He would knock on somebody's door if they were believed to be a slave stater, somebody who was allied with Missouri, and he would drag them out in the yard, and then they would butcher them with swords. It was just a horrible thing. This painting of John Brown kind of does justice to this fanatic. And he believed that everything he was doing was in the name of the Lord. So he would wave his Bible around and tell everybody he was murdering for the Lord. He was really something. He was made into a huge hero, both before and after the Civil War, by the abolitionists. Not unlike what we do today, where some criminals or people that get crossways with the law are turned into heroes. And on the other side, on the Confederate side, he was considered to be worse than a terrorist. They probably had him more correctly. There were things going on during this period, like the raid at Quantrill's raid in Lawrence, Kansas, where hundreds of people were massacred. It was just one of the most vicious, horrible battles. It was, in all regards, like a civilian version of the Civil War. And they had these posses. In fact, if you've ever seen the Clint Eastwood movie, The Outlaw Josie Wales, that is about Bleeding Kansas. The outlaw Josie Wales was one of those people who was riding in these posses. And as it turns out, James Denver, during this period, managed to negotiate and ruled Kansas Territory with such a firm hand, without showing favor to either side, that he was completely respected by both sides. And what I read is that that was one of the reasons that when Colorado was about to be admitted as a state and they settled the first city in Colorado, the people who went there and settled it named it after James Denver. So Denver, Colorado is named after a guy from Wilmington. And a lot of people have forgotten that. Colorado has not. His portrait is in their capital. Then he goes to the Civil War. This is actually depicting Confederates at the Battle of Corinth, where James W. Denver fought. But it's a good depiction of what he did, which is if you were a general, as he was, your job in those days was to lead your troops. You didn't sit behind the lines and give orders. You were out there in the front lines, and they would stay on their horse, making themselves a target. And the reason was to encourage the men, to show them courage, because courage is contagious. So he actually did that. He went into battle at the Battle of Corinth on top of his horse. Unbelievably, nobody shot him, they missed. But a lot of his men were killed in that battle. And after the war, he came back and he became a politician. He ran for office several times. He served in Congress. He was quite a well-respected man here at Wilmington, as you can imagine, known as the General. In fact, in World War II, I think it was, they even named a Liberty ship after him. And that's how well known he was in those days. So the next story is about Cincinnati's first serial killer. As it turns out, she was also the first woman electrocuted in the electric chair in Ohio. Her name was Anna Marie Hahn. She was, her MO was that she would cozy up to elderly German men who were single or widowed, and she would tell them that she was from their village in Germany, and she actually had immigrated to the U.S. only a few years before this. And she would make friends with them until they were telling their friends that they had a new girlfriend. And pretty soon their mortgage, their bank account, all of it was signed over to her. And then one night she'd come over and cook dinner. And that was their last supper. What she would do is she would poison their dinner with arsenic, which is a horrible way to die. It's nothing cute about it. And she would then sit there and watch as they died in front of her. They believe that she killed maybe 11, 12 people, but the number could be even higher, like 16, maybe 20. It was a sensational case. You couldn't even get a seat in the courthouse to see this. The prosecutor, this is one of those great little things about investigating history, where you stumble across a little stone and you turn it over and you find another great story. So the prosecutor in this case was Dudley Outcall. Here he is holding the salt shaker that was used to convict her, because the forensic people at the University of Cincinnati found arsenic in the salt shaker. And the salt shaker was in her purse. So they were able to convict her with that, along with lots of other evidence. But another sidebar to this is that Cincinnati was one of the very first cities to make a partnership with the local medical school and enlist the forensic aid of scientists like doctors, pharmacists, chemists. So we actually had the first CSI in Cincinnati. And they really, this was one of the biggest cases they had that actually broke that case. And then I started looking at Dudley Outcall, and it turns out he flew with Eddie Rickenbacker in the Hat and the Ring Squadron in World War I. What a colorful guy. And then, not only that, when Rickenbacker came back and started building Indy 500 race teams, Dudley Outcall would drive the cars occasionally and work in his pit crew, all the while being the prosecutor in Cincinnati. And then, when World War II came out many years later and he was well past the age of enlistment, he insisted on going back into the military and flying again. And what he did is he was ferrying a B-24, I think, from Mississippi to Washington, D.C., and the plane exploded in midair, and no trace of him was ever found. A great story, a hero, a local hero, but he was the man who convicted Anna Marie Hahn. Another story is called Shakers. is about the Shakers of Whitewater Village, which again is over on this, what would be the southwest side of Cincinnati near North Bend. This was a huge community of Shakers. The interesting thing about it, if you go over there, you're going to find a cemetery. And that cemetery, I'll show you in a minute, is, well, let's go ahead and look at it. Hardly any graves in there. And it's kind of curious because that goes way back to the 1870s, and you'd think that it would have been populated because there were hundreds of people in this Shaker village. But as it turns out, you go to this monument right here in the front of it, and it says, it is a community, an order of celibate Christian communists. I never thought I'd find those three words in the same sentence. But celibate Christian communists. So communists in those days were not like Marx communists as much as they were communal living. The celibacy part, though, was very important. And that was the big taboo, the ultimate sin was to have children. Now, if you don't have children, you don't populate a cemetery. Hence the empty cemetery, which is the first clue. This community would gather in these circular dances and shake the floors. They would go into trances of religious ecstasy or terror, and that's how they got the name Shakers. Now, during this period, 2 women were evicted from the Whitewater community and thrown out for breaking the vow of celibacy. And the reason was, during this period, the Shaker community was struggling with finances, and they began to take in the black sheep sons of wealthy Cincinnati families. And one of these guys, the typical, he was a drunk, he was totally dipsomaniac, and they took him in to dry him out and to try and make a man of him. And while they did, he preyed on these women. And one was the mother and the other was her daughter. And they were both said to be very beautiful women, strikingly beautiful. So they were kicked out of the Shaker community. Eventually, the predator there left on his own. He was not punished. They came to Cincinnati, and they did not do well. It was an extremely hard transition for somebody who's grown up in that communal living, where everything is organized and set up for you every day, to try and find work, to try and make their way. They couldn't find a place to live. They couldn't find good jobs. They didn't want to do the jobs that they got. And eventually, what happens is we have a suicide, a double suicide in a downtown hotel. And the Cincinnati police detective who investigated it was never really comfortable with the idea that this was a suicide. So there's a bit of a mystery here. And the mystery is, what happened to them? Well, think about it. One of them was apparently pregnant. And if that scandal had followed them to Cincinnati, these wealthy families would have been in jeopardy. Their reputation could be ruined. So there's certainly motive and means and opportunity. It's a fascinating story, but the whole story of the Shakers is just amazing. It was a huge community. They just didn't leave much behind. Finally, we get into the story that's called Feeding Frenzy. And this is about the fen-phen trial. Anybody here remember the drug fen-phen? It was used by millions of women, mainly women, during the 80s as a quick weight loss method. Only it turned out, unfortunately for the women who used it, that it also caused cardiopulmonary hypertension, which makes your lungs fill up with fluid and you eventually just drown in your own body fluids. And it caused a permanent damage to the mechanisms in the body that create serotonin and keep you happy. So people were unable to ever make that again. They couldn't be happy. They were dying slowly from this pulmonary hypertension. And then that triggered just a feeding frenzy of litigation. Now that litigation found its way to northern Kentucky, and the man who jumped in on it to get a piece of the action was Stan Chesley. Who remembers Stan Chesley? Yeah, so he was known as the Master of Disaster. He was one of the most famous trial lawyers in the world. He stayed at the Clinton White House on numerous occasions, and he raised $30 million for Bill Clinton at fundraisers in Cincinnati. And that's how his wife, Susan DeLotte, became a federal judge. as she was appointed by Bill Clinton as a thank you for that $30 million. Now what we see in this though is we also see this history of we always want the shortcut. It's human nature. So here's an ad for cigarettes saying, you know, smoke a cigarette, you'll lose weight. You might die young, but you'll look good. Here's some more of this stuff. Shake it off. Or I love the obesity soap. Just get in the shower and wash with obesity soap and the pounds will fall away. So this led to a litigation that eventually, because these lawyers were so recklessly crooked, what they did, usually in a class action suit, the lawyers are entitled to 1/3. Well, they took 2/3, and then they kept taking them. They would take these victims of fen-phen, and they would tell them to meet them in the food court at Florence Y'all Mall. And that's where they would offer a check for maybe $5,000. Well, these people were entitled to probably $50,000, $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 as part of this settlement. And they'd give them a check for $5,000 and then tell them if they asked any questions, they could be prosecuted and put in jail. They were lying. This is how they totally filched all the money, most everything they could from these poor victims. And as a result, when this was finally uncovered, the judge in the trial at one point said, I'd like to put all the lawyers in jail. And they all deserved it. So Stan Chesley was finally uncovered for the scam artist he was. He was working with a crooked judge in northern Kentucky who would give him any verdict that he wanted for the right amount of money. And he was disbarred in Kentucky, which meant that Ohio, which has a reciprocity with Kentucky, also had to disbar him. And that was the end of the career for the master of disaster. He finally stepped in it too deep. As a result, he fought many years to try and even attempting to sue the victims that he had cheated to make them go away, and it didn't work. And he was forced ultimately to pay a $20 million damage award, which was only a fraction of what he took. And the Wall Street Journal at the time wrote an editorial about it saying that his behavior and the behavior of these lawyers in this case shocks the conscience. It was such a bad example of class actions that it became a textbook case for tort reform. And still today, there's a lot of arguments that need to be made for that. So, well, we're always looking for these shortcuts. Well, look where we are now. I'm not saying this is as dangerous as fen-phen. I am saying that the chemical way that this stuff works, people are still not real sure about what it does to your body. But we're using it by the millions. And although you'll see in all the ads, it says only for the use of obesity, where it's threatening your life. But no, it's used for cosmetic reasons. We can see that all over. Just turn on the television and look at somebody who used to be kind of stout, who's no longer. You say, whoa. No, they probably didn't get it working out. So finally, this book ends with a collection of places. Let's see if that gets to that next slide. It got stuck. Okay, well, I'll just tell you about it. So finally, this book, The Magical History Tour, part of it, ends with a collection of places that you can go for half-day trips or day trips all over Cincinnati to soak up this wonderful Cincinnati history. This place is on that list with the address and location. And we have the Cincinnati Police Museum. We have log cabins that are perfectly preserved from the days when the first settlers came here. We have Spring Grove Cemetery, which is a great place to walk around and soak up history. There are just unbelievable things there. And it's a lovely arboretum as well. The Golden Lamb in Lebanon, another place that's just steeped in local history, going all the way back to the stagecoach days. And then Camp Dennison is another, where that's where the first troops during the Civil War were mustered in. And then it later became the field hospital for a lot of young men who were wounded at Shiloh, including Confederates. And there's just great stories around all of these places, and really wonderful to just walk around and soak it up. So, with that, I will go ahead and take questions. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
What year did the murder
that would have been during this, was contemporaneous with this case, I would say about the 1870 to about 1880. And then it was finally closed down. And part of the reason was the outrage over what was going on with these bodies. There's a good argument that these medical students needed something to learn anatomy, that there was nothing available. People didn't donate their bodies to science in those days. But they became so casual and cruel in the way they treated the bodies and the way they took them. Most of the bodies were taken from the poor, in the pauper cemeteries, people who didn't have any leverage to make a noise about it. And then they do things like, if you go back, don't recommend it, but in my research you can go back and find these pictures that these guys would take with a bunch of corpses sitting around playing cards. And they would pose them with their cards, and just did weird stuff like that. That didn't go over well.
So it was not in existence in the 1850s?
No, I think what happened is it eventually kind of morphed into the University of Cincinnati Medical School. Any other questions? I'll tell you a story about Camp Dennison. So Camp Dennison, when these boys were brought from the battlefield in Shiloh, it was Cincinnati who rescued most of them. We had something called the Hamilton County Sanitation Commission, because there was no Red Cross at that time. We sent steamboats down to the battlefield in southern Tennessee, right on the border of Mississippi, and picked these boys up and brought them back. And at that time, Camp Dennison was not a hospital, but we turned it into a field hospital. Now, all these boys that recuperated, including a few Confederates, could thank the Hamilton County Sanitation Commission. Well, there was a doctor at the time, and he's trying to get these men back on their feet. And he found that they just couldn't get nutrition because they didn't have good dental care to handle the tough cuts of meat that the Army issued. And they were really tough. And at those times, in those days, to enlist in the Union Army, the minimum was to have 3 teeth. So that tells you just what kind of condition the dental care was in those days. So he's trying to figure out, how can I get these guys nourished enough to get back on their feet? And he came up with this idea to grind the meat up and mix it with potatoes and turnips and throw in a little gravy. And he invented something that eventually became a staple on TV dinners. Does anybody know what that is?
He thinks it's meatloaf.
It's close. Salisbury steak. His name was Dr. John Salisbury. Now, when I was growing up, I always thought that came from England. Salisbury steak. No, it came from Camp Dennison right here in Cincinnati. He invented that, and he became a famous nutritionist after the war with a diet that was made up of only 2 things: beef steak and coffee. So if we have oh yeah, children.
Was there anything else on General Denver that you'd like to share with the crowd, or any like interesting vignettes that you found that didn't make it into the presentation?
Yeah, this place was just a gold mine, and thank you so much for helping. It's just so much fun to be able to actually go see his uniform and some of his weapons and the things he did. His letters especially are good. I quote many of them in the book. The letters that he wrote home to his wife, who was living here, and he sent these letters home talking about the problems he was having, how difficult it was to deal with this stuff in Kansas, how difficult it was in the Union Army, the things that were happening. It's a really good kind of time travel to go back and see. And he was a good writer. He was not somebody who couldn't write. He could write. And he really let you into that world. So I highly recommend it. He's just a fascinating person. I'm sure there's so much more to his story. Yes.
This may be a question for you, but are any of those letters here, or are they available?
Yeah. So we do have a collection of the Rombach, Denver, and Williams family letters here. They have been digitized. We are hoping to migrate them onto a server or like a website platform where the public would have general access to them. We don't have every single letter. A couple of years ago, quite a few of them went to auction and we were unable to acquire them. But we do have them. They were sent back to Rombach Place is what they addressed it as, which would have arrived at the front of the house up there. and his wife Louise was here maintaining the home, their 4 children, and really, doing everyday life here while he was away gallivanting around the world. But we do have quite a few. We also have letters between he and his father-in-law, Matthew Rombach, discussing farm conditions and selling hogs and doing different agricultural activities here in Clinton County. So yes, we do.
One other thing comes to mind, which is as a measure of how respected this man was. During the Civil War, if you were a politician, you could become a general very easily, because they would expect you to go out. You'd be an officer because you could go out and recruit people from your community because you're a leader, you're a politician. People look up to you. So they would appoint politicians, but it was very political. And remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. James Denver was a Democrat. And James Denver had actively campaigned and supported Lincoln's opponent during the previous election. And yet, Lincoln appointed personally James Denver as a Civil War general. So that just shows the respect that he had transcended that political barrier, because that just almost never happened. And a lot of people were scandalized by it. The other thing is that when he was in Kansas, there was a man named Lane who became his mortal enemy. And there's a fascinating story around that this man followed him from Kansas all the way through his political career. And at every opportunity did everything he could to sabotage James W. Denver. It's very possible he could have been a vice president, even a president, if not for that mortal enemy that he made in Kansas. And this guy was a bad piece of work. He was raiding people's farms and then taking the property personally. So what he was doing is he's pretending to be on one of these noble causes of bleeding Kansas, when actually he was just stealing people's property. But fascinating story. Well, unless that's, I think that takes care of it. I'll be over here signing books, and we'll see if we can raise some money for the museum.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. As he mentioned, if you're interested in purchasing a book, he has all of them here. Part of the proceeds will go to the History Center. Thank you so much for that. And then if you get into the Christmas season or birthday or whatever and you have not purchased one of these books, we are carrying the most recent book featuring General Denver in our gift shop that you can get here at the History Center. So thank you all so much for attending. This is our second Saturday program. This is a new initiative, to the opportunity to get people in the door and have a poignant, important conversation and educational opportunity once a month, which is the second Saturday of every month. Now, September, we will be out at the Corn Festival, so don't come here, visit us out at the Corn Festival, but we do have programs lined up for October, November, and December. You can learn more on our website or on our social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. This program was videoed and will be on our YouTube page later this evening, so if you had a friend that wasn't able to make it, please share it with them. So if you have any questions, come see me, come see Peter, and thank you all so much for being here. Have a great afternoon.
Well,